I am again thankful to Muslim Institute for organizing such a wonderful session and for having invited one of our honorable guests from Indonesia and also the Indonesian Embassy and the High Commission for organizing and helping and connecting with the people of Pakistan in various manners. As my young worthy friend mentioned, that my area has been public international law. But alongside public international law, I have a practitioner's experience of a regular lawyer. And my recent preoccupation is identifying the covenantal framework in the Qur'an, which is again a legal exercise. And one is able to identify some remarkable legal structure, the legal architecture of the Qur'an. And in that, we have been able to identify numerous personal covenants that Allah has directly with the believers. And in addition to that, there are covenants under the Quran, which basically means that when you say akud, when you talk about misak, these terminologies do not cover merely the historic covenants. They also cover the present day international contracts, daily agreements that you do. They also cover international treaties that need to be upheld by the Muslims. They also cover legislative covenants, because every law of the land is a social contract between the state and an individual. So that is covered in the definition of the word misak, in the definition of the word akud, which Quran so strongly emphasizes. So therefore, it is very convenient for a Muslim to identify a commonality to uphold the law in his country as an aspect and element of his faith. It is an obligation on every Muslim to uphold all misak that are under the Quran, because whether it is a private contract that we do for trades, I am just coming right now from an attempted mediation between two businessmen where they are struggling on a dispute relating to interpretation of a contract. Contract, honorable guest, is so significant from a Quranic standpoint and its upholding that the Holy Prophet emphasized upon it. Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, was not only the lawgiver but also an international law practitioner, because he drafted treaties, he executed treaties, he made use and took advantage of the treaties and used treaties as a basis to create influence, the ghalba that we romanticize so much as Muslims. The Prophet's sunnah is not only to use ghalba through the use of force wherever appropriate as per the law of the land, but also through the smart, visionary use of international treaty negotiations. So that sunnah of the Prophet, that he was a treaty negotiator, has been so taken at a backside, it has taken a backseat in the Muslim community. We do not participate in international global negotiation exercises. Today, the forums of Shura that the Quran so strongly emphasizes have been elevated from ulama, from madrasas, from mosques. They have gone to parliaments, UN General Assembly, UN Security Council, UN SCAP, and so on. So all these have become venues of shura, or consultation venues. So United Nations calendar of events for every year, every conference, honorable guest, is a venue of shura where there is a legal compulsion of the Muslim communities and the Muslim states to participate wholeheartedly. So I believe that while the Muslims talk about collective actions and others, there should be a very intelligent collaboration amongst them so that they participate with a uniform strategy at global forums. These forums of Shura, these forums where consultations take place, we need to be proactive in that. That was the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. We need to excel in the art of treaty negotiations. We need to excel in the expertise that can bring us at par with people who are into far developed jurisdictions. So therefore, we also have to be mindful that everyday issues that we deal with in our society as traders, as businessmen, as ordinary citizens, are tied up with every contract. So if you are a businessman, you are doing a purchase order. If you are selling a house, you are going into an agreement to sell. If you are manufacturing a bottling plant, you're putting on a label. And the covenant has specific covenants. Quran has specific covenants with the entrepreneurs, with the believer entrepreneur. There's a specific covenant in the Quran in which the believer is asked to excel in the world, to search fazl, because the excellence is tied up regarding his claim that he is the Khalifa, the deputy, the vicegerent of Allah Ta'ala on earth. What a privilege, what a declaration, what a remarkable statement to have, what a neon sign to be attracted to. We, each one of you, are the Ashraf Makhluk, the Behtareen, the best. So how do you prove it? You only prove it because if you excel in the worldly role, the role that you have, whether it's the role of a business person, whether it's the role of an agriculturalist, whether it's the role of a scientist, whether it's the role of a PhD scholar, whether it's the role of a lawyer, architect, journalist, whatever worldly role you are in, there is an implied covenant that you need to excel in that role. Demonstrate why you as a species are so brilliant. That will belittle the claim of the adverse force because you were suspected not as good as Allah thinks you are. So as much the trust that the Creator has in each one of us, we have an implied duty to excel. So that covenant we need to uphold. And if we are an entrepreneur, whether in Indonesia, in Pakistan, anywhere, as a believer, we believe in the Quran, we have a complete charter to follow. And that charter includes we have to uphold standards. We have to uphold weights and measures. Invariably, people link it up with just scales. I submit it is a far wider concept. In whatsoever profession you are, the standards, the licensing regimes of those professions have to be upheld. I remember my team is writing an article called The Iron Ring of the Quran, Excellency. In that article, we are saying that engineers in Canada, upon graduation, are given a steel iron ring so that as a reminder of upholding professional engineering standards that they are taught. Quran's iron ring is telling us, instructing us that we must uphold our trade standards. Whether I am a manufacturer, I am an engineer, I am a doctor, I am a lawyer, my license terms determine the standards of my professional work. Doctor's license terms determine the standards he has to uphold that. A businessman, a manufacturer, an indentor, an agent, a private sector, public-private partnership framework, they all have to uphold standards. So Quran's invisible iron ring has to be felt, has to be recognized, that it is talking to each one of us that whichever venue you are, wherever profession you are stationed, whatever you are doing, you have to uphold the standards of that work, that function that you are performing. Likewise, we are also working on what we call Maroof, the concept of Maroof, Excellency. The concept of Maroof is traditionally viewed as something associated with the custom. But whenever there is a certain custom, that needs to be conformed with. We argue that today, the customs have been codified into implementing domestic statutes, the laws of the state. So it was Maroof way of transacting or buying property in Arabia, in Hijaz, 1400 years ago, when someone would take a bag of ashrafis, give it to someone who is a seller, take the possession, and that would be the Maroof way of buying a land. Today, the Maroof way of buying the land is defined by the Transfer of Property Act. It is defined by the Registration Act. It is defined by the Stamp Act. So the local legislation has become an evidence of what Maroof constitutes. So one can go on giving examples that you and we need to identify in Indonesia, in Pakistan, those laws, those statutes that define Maroof, that define good and bad. Because kindly remember, the sin of yesterday that we in Urdu, people from Islamabad recognize, guna. The sin of yesterday or guna of yesterday is today's offense in most of the cases. So if you look at the penal code of Indonesia, if you look at the penal code of Pakistan, it's a list of 450 offenses. What are they? They were traditionally, before penal code came into existence, they were viewed as sins, guna. Marna nahi kisi ko, hurt, no one should hurt someone, no one should abuse someone, no one should kill anyone, modesty of women, no one should do fraud, no one should be given amana, should not. Today, those gunas which were traditionally viewed are now listed down as criminal breach of trust, as murder, as kidnapping, and then there are refined wrongs like money laundering and so on and so forth, and counterterrorism and so on. So what I'm saying is, ladies and gentlemen, that this exercise by the scholars in both the countries need to be undertaken, where we can find synergy with the Quranic framework and the laws of the land that are available. There is sometimes an objection by some of my friends who say, well, why should we obey this law? This is written by the Angrez or the Britishers, or they left by the Dutch. This is not a law of land. This is not Islamic law. This is not Sharia law. So we are not obliged to, and this is the narrative of the non-state actors as well. I submit, and the work that we are doing demonstrates that laws you are able to identify them with reference to the modern framework and the Quranic framework. The word tayyib, just pick up the word tayyib, just one phrase of the Quran. The entire transparency framework, the United Nations Convention on Corruption, which is a multilateral treaty talking about how transparency has to be ensured in various processes of the government, is actually a tafsir of the term tayyib. But we need to join them together to make people, citizens, realize that if they are fulfilling the law, they are at the same time fulfilling the mandate of the Quran, the covenantal link that the Quran tells them to uphold. So if you are talking about maroof, as I mentioned, as a single phrase, and one can go on talking about such phraseology, but my submission would be that we need to bring this clarity to the ordinary people, that the law of the land that they are to follow, as long as it is not inconsistent with Islam, as long as it is not inconsistent with a specific verse or the sunnah of the Holy Prophet of Islam, it should be accepted, declared, and deemed to be in conformity with the Quran. And therefore, the mental intent, the niyat that you have when you are complying with the law will bring you dividends, because we believe in the jurisdiction hereafter. We all, those who believe in Quran, they have to believe in the jurisdiction hereafter. So if you believe that you are doing something complying with the law which is in sync with the Quranic mandate, then you are ensuring rewards in the jurisdiction thereafter. So while you may think that there is an important hadith or a mention in the Quran that do amle saleh. Now amle saleh is also a wonder phrase of the Quran for a Quranic state, or for a state which is based on Islam or democracy. There is nothing inconsistent with that. So amle saleh means good deeds. Who defines good deeds? Good deeds, or ahkam Quran for that matter. Ahkam Quran 200-300 years ago were viewed as morality and ethics. But again, today, most of these morality and ethics have been codified not only in domestic legislation, but also multilateral treaties and conventions. So if CDA, where we sit together today, Capital Development Authority law, tells me and you and whosoever is making a house in Islamabad to leave 10 feet to ensure sunshine for the neighbor, air for the neighbor, and privacy for the neighbor, that's exactly what Quran is telling me. But if I'm able to join in my mind or through a narrative that CDA regulations relating to housing, when connected with Quran, create a complete package, then suddenly I am a responsible citizen. In other words, Excellency, a law-abiding citizen is a muttaqi. The muttaqi, the definition of a muttaqi, again, my team is working on that, to identifying legal features of the muttaqi. Who is a muttaqi? Of course, Quran has identified what he should be doing, what he should not be doing. He should be vigilant about how he's avoiding the bad and how he's following the good. The muttaqi, when we compared the legal elements with a fictitious concept of a reasonable person, which has been declared by the English case law, which basically means, the lawyers here would know that reasonable person is a fictitious person created by legislation, by judgments of the superior courts in cases of negligence, murder, and criminal liability. And the idea is that you imagine an ideal person who is absolutely reasonable. So how will he function, act in this situation in which this person who has transgressed has acted? And you apply those standards and you say, well, a reasonable person in these circumstances would not have done what he has done. So my submission is the structure, the legal features of a muttaqi are mirror imaging the concept of a reasonable person. So today, if to a young man or a young student I tell him, be a muttaqi, he'll start scratching his head. But if I tell him, become a reasonable person, he'll say, yes, I understand what you're saying. So what I'm saying is that approach towards lingo, towards the discipline of the society. Again, if I may give one more or two more suggestions in this regard, that when we talk about the legal structure of the state, again, the Shura doctrine controls the outcome. There is an institution of Khilafat. That Khilafat has been there. It's a geographical concept associated with individuals, the choice of people. But then people may choose a different framework. Again, that is a mandate given by the Qur'an itself. So people say, we'll go for the presidential system. Some people say, we'll go for the sovereign authority. Some people say, no, parliamentary system. That ought to be allowed as perfectly legitimate within the Islamic jurisprudence framework. And those who argue otherwise, they need to be rebutted. They need to be put across this point to be very clearly that Islam permits all kinds of structures as long as you are based on the popular support and the will of the people, whichever will they wish to take, whichever direction that will wishes to go, we have to respect that will. So therefore, the structure of the state is a doctrine genuinely left as a flexible doctrine. We talk of constitutions, there's a concept called occupying field. Sometimes the federal government occupies field of legislation in certain areas and leaves the remaining. So Quran has also occupied certain areas for legislation. The rest it has left to the people and to the generations to follow. Those areas that have been occupied by the Quran are inheritance, contracts, and punishments in terms of administration of justice. The rest, or barring a few more areas, the rest has been left to the people like you and me, because we are all deputies. The deputies are competent enough, deemed competent enough by the Creator to delegate or to allow this mandate and freedom for them. So given that, I think the narrative that ought to be worked on is that the laws that exist in various countries create a discipline, avoid order, avoid fasad, which is a larger context. Because the Quran is telling us, having a covenant with mediators directly, that if you prevent dispute somehow, I am going to reward you far more than you believe. Direct covenant by Allah with the potential mediator. So I was in Riyadh in a conference of international arbitrators a little while ago, and I said, arbitration, adjudication of disputes, alternative dispute resolutions are something that falls in this domain. Because if we are able to internalize the sanctity of our own commitments that we make, we reduce a lot of disputes which come to the courts. Because what is a dispute essentially? One party rethinks his commitment, his or her commitment. That's it. Rethinks, revisits what he has agreed with the other party, whether orally or otherwise. So on the terms of oral contract, we have also doing another work which is comparing Vienna Convention on the law of treaties with the Quranic law of treaty. The Vienna Convention on laws of treaties says it was only applying to written agreements. The Quranic treaty law says it applies to oral commitments as well. So the liability is far all envisaging. And that needs to be realized. Somehow this narrative has not been realized as much as it deserves to be. Because the upholding of commercial commitments is crucial for the economic development. And it is so important that when I read this verse of Quran in which Quran or Allah Ta'ala is giving us a tutorial on how to draft a contract. The only divine book that tells you how to draft a contract. because of the significance of the commercial commitments. And Allah knows well that if the believer will honor this commitment, the economy of his area, of his environment, his tribe, his city, his country will begin to move ahead. No wonder, Excellency, the United States Constitution, Article 1, Subarticle 11, specifically says no one can make laws against a contract. It is remarkable. So while the constitution of that state, which has become the economic might of all times in the recent times, which is US government, what is they basing their entire doctrine on? Upholding the covenant, something that my and your Quran tells us, something that we completely have forgotten about it, something that our ulama have failed to tell to us, that you need to honor commercial agreements. The mandate of the Quran is not confined to religious agreements. It is confined to everyday commitments that we make. So the disclosures that we do, the commitments that we do ought to be recognized in that sense. Today, when we talk about the number of laws, and when someone tells me, I have friends who says, we need Sharia law, Mr. Sufi. I said, okay, fine, let's draft it. He said, yes, we should do something about the Sharia law. It has to be made applicable. And I said, how would you draft in Sharia language Motor Vehicles Act? The answer is, well, we'll talk about it. So I said, you will exactly write the same thing, what is more or less written. If you were to draft the maritime principles of merchant shipping licensing, yours in Archipelago, how would you draft it in a Sharia sense? And then, well, actually, we'll try and add in the preamble some reference of the Quran. I said, then the operation document. Because, the ships, their way maintenance, the seafarers, it's become such a complex regime. It has to be syncing it with the global community framework. Yes. So therefore, you pick up any other agreement. I remember reading a judgment of the Supreme Court of UK, in which two parties relied on a Sharia law for a private agreement, and the Judge Sahab was struggling to figure out where is the codified Sharia law that I need to apply. There are opinions, there are views, there are different fatwas, there are schools of thoughts, but where is the codified law that I need to apply? And they had an ex-justice of Pakistan Sharia court flown there as a witness, and yet people were struggling with that. So what I am saying is that while on one hand, those who want to have a codified Sharia law framework continue to work if they so wish, but in the meanwhile, what exists has to be adopted. What exists has to be declared, that it is not inconsistent. What exists has to be given a deeming clause. And if you do that, you bring Quran in everyday life of all the Muslims, whether they are in Pakistan or in where. And that's what Dr. Qibla's council was doing, the constitutional body. Its primary mandate was to review the laws written by the British, over 8,000 federal statutes, 3,500 provincial statutes. You want to scrap them, rewrite them, fabiha. You attempted only in only one or two areas. Barely Hudud laws were brought up. And then there was a parallel conveyor belt of prosecution of the CRPC. So that choice has been there. And the other serious exercise, or the de novo exercise, were done in Muslim family laws, which is, everyone struggled with that. Commissions and after commissions bad. Despite that very brief law, still it is not free from controversies even today. People question it, people question its frameworks. So, and then another attempt that I recall is the Qanun-e-Shahadat, or the Evidence Act. Again, those of us who are familiar with law would know that simply paragraphs were moved up and down in sequence, and maybe one or two provisions were added, and that was about all. So while, as I say, we have due regard for the codification of the Sharia law exercise that may be done, but at the same time, the inherent link of these laws, as long as they are identifying what is good and what is bad, and what is something which is representing the historic consensus based on what is recognized as customary upholding framework, we need to identify all those provisions. And that way, we will be bringing them people within the framework of what we call the rule of law. So upholding the rule of law of any country and upholding the global rule of law. Excellency, lastly, I would just like to talk about few common issues that I think from a legal point of view are common, and especially between Pakistan and Indonesia. Law of the Sea Convention 1982. Indonesia, as participants would know, is an archipelago. Archipelago means a group of islands, thousands of them. And if draw a circle around a group of islands and the number. So if there are a group of islands, you put a circle around them and the water within the water body is lesser than the landmass. It's an archipelago, and you will have an exclusive economic zone around that and a continental shelf around that. So those are another interesting areas where the government of Pakistan and the people of Pakistan and the experts of Pakistan can extend coordination with scholars in Indonesia. The other is counterterrorism framework. Again, there is an enormous pressure from the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 various resolutions, including 1373 on counterterrorism, 1267 on Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and so on, where all the countries, including the Muslim countries, are being asked to take suitable measures to de-radicalize and counter-terrorism frameworks. And every country has an obligation to submit an annual report to the UN Security Council. Indonesia has, we have, so we all have to work in that direction with a collaborative framework. And since, as one of my colleagues tells us, the Qur'an is something that is followed by 2 billion people. Most of them reside in our two countries. We need to take it seriously. We need to seed synergy with the law of the land and international treaties. I thank you.